Again, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Just real quick, a few housekeeping items. We have muted everyone, so we're not hearing any potential crunching of papers and moving around. But we want you to actually, please be interactive. So if you have a question, certainly just post it in the chat room. I'll be monitoring it. I should introduce myself. My name is Heather Goodnight. I'm with Triumphant Software. And the other thing that you can do is raise your hand. So sometimes we get into this mode of listening, and it's hard, depending on the delays of voice and things like that. But I will make sure that we get your questions answered, as well as, if you've got one that you'd like to discuss further, raise your hand and we'll unmute you. So with that said, Watchful Software and Triumphant Inc. are really excited to introduce Patrick Floor as our guest speaker today. Other than the credentials, which if you'll go to the credential page, Patrick, there you go. Other than the credentials you see on the slide here, Patrick's analyst experience will bring to light how to look at multiple sources of data, understand their frameworks, bias, and how to measure breach costs in your own environment. So the what's in it for me, why should you care about deconstructing the cost of a data breach? As the scope of security professionals continues to grow within the enterprise, the security program gains more significant. Unfortunately, we've seen that many of those budgets don't always grow accordingly. So today's webinar focuses on providing you guys the information that you guys would need to represent risk monetarily and defensively. So with that, Patrick, I will hand it to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Heather. Good morning, everyone. Here's what we're going to talk about today, what I'm going to talk about today. Each one of these topics could be a discussion of hours and hours and hours, so I'm going to be flying a little bit high and going pretty quickly. I think I would like to just make a comment at the beginning about why I became interested in all of this in the first place. It had to do with the TJX breach back in 2007, and I just didn't quite believe what I was reading in the press and in the blog sphere, that the cost of that particular breach could be billions and billions and billions of dollars. Something didn't quite ring true, so I put on my analytic hat and started thinking about it and started breaking down the different attributes and domains and other things involved in understanding a data breach. So here are 6 topics we're going to cover: threat landscape, types and costs of data, sources of data, examples of specific breaches, and then I'll have some closing remarks. So threat landscape, obviously something of huge interest to all of us. The threat landscape is composed of actors who work on the inside, actors who work on the outside. Some of them are malicious, some of them are not. Sometimes it's just a simple mistake. Sometimes it's an act of nature. There are all kinds of threat actors. So the slide we're looking at here just takes some numbers from 3 different sources. If you're not aware, one of the most widely respected reports in our industry is the Verizon Data Breach Incident Report, which was the newest version was published just last week. So I've got some numbers in here from there. So as you can read, 14% of breaches, but almost 70% of security events or incidents were caused by insiders. Ponemon and Symantec looked at this a year ago and found about 33%, and then CERT, the folks at Carnegie Mellon University, who actually have an insider threat center. They have a database. They published a great book, if you're interested in this, on the insider threat. They found numbers in the low 20%. Part of the reason that these numbers vary, there are a couple of reasons. One has to do with the sample. Each of these groups is looking at a different sample, and each one of them would stress to you, you have to be aware of what's called a sampling frame bias, or if you've ever worked in medicine, something called a bias to external validity. Basically, you have the data that you have, you report on what you have, and you tell people to be judicious when they consider the data and when they apply it to their own circumstances. External threats are the ones that tend to make the press more often, generally speaking, unless it's a flaming example of a malicious internal threat. Companies tend to be very quiet about them. Oftentimes, they don't even prosecute the people responsible. External threats, though, the hackers, all the different kinds of attacks that we know about. I include negligence as a potential external threat. You could have a business partner with poor security practices. You could have somebody working from home. There are a lot of ways that external threats can cause compromises. Here's some numbers from the different surveys that over 90% of data breaches, but only 31% of incidents in the current DBIR were caused by external threats. And I should say, I didn't put it in here, external and internal are defined quite precisely in the report. Something that strikes me as very interesting is this 76% of network intrusions caused by weak or stolen credentials. That one really kind of amazes me. 58% of external threats are involved with crime, and then 40%, just to cite another number, caused by malware. The malware number in the DBR is actually down a bit from the year before. It's hard to tell whether that is meaningful or it's just because of a different sample. So always keep that in mind. So who are the external threat agents? Well, as you can read here, that mostly they're criminals and state affiliated or else unknown. The new DBIR actually does something very interesting in its graphics. It attempts to split out in most of the graphics the difference between financially motivated exploits and state-affiliated type of exploits, or criminal and state-affiliated. And one of the things you see is that the organized criminals are pretty much after financial data, but that the state-affiliated agents are almost entirely interested in intellectual property. The other thing we're going to see on the next slide is almost all compromises of financial information were rated by the Verizon team as low or very low difficulty. Almost all of the moderately difficult and highly difficult exploits that they investigated and their partners investigated were related to state-sponsored theft of intellectual property and espionage. So I thought that it's a pretty clean split if you read the report, and I found that really very interesting because the nature of the attacks, the nature of the persistence, the criminals are pretty much interested in smash and grab. They're interested in targets of opportunity, although from time to time they do make a specific target of someone, whereas the people interested in stealing your intellectual property and the state actors are quite motivated to stay below the radar, remain invisible for as long as they can, and keep drinking from the well for years and years and years. And one of the slides we did have in here, but we took out, had to do with the length of time to discover an attack. And there are a number of sources. Mandiant publishes a report called M-Trends, the Verizon report, and others that suggest that most data exploits aren't discovered for at least 6 months, and some of them aren't discovered for years. So something to give you a thought. All right, so that's a little bit about external threats, the who and the what. So what about the data that they're after? What kinds of data do you have? Well, here are 5 categories that come to mind that might be of interest to an external party or might be exposed by accident. Operational data would include things like internal email and phone lists, might include network diagrams, might include setup for machinery, could really include any kind of data that you need to run your business. Intellectual property, maybe, the famous one that comes to mind is that formula for Coca-Cola allegedly hidden in a safe somewhere. Plans, merger and acquisition plans, that sort of thing. Financial information would include bank account numbers, tax returns. It might include unreleased financial statements that would be posted for publicly traded companies, but just not quite yet. If you could get hold of those a week or two in advance of their publication, you might come out really well in the stock market. And then, of course, PII, name, address, birth date, social security number, and a lot to be said in this subject, not enough time to do it, but what's really interesting here is that the definitions of personally identifiable information are continually changing, and people are starting to make account of the ways these things can be correlated. So you might have two independent types of personal data that really wouldn't be considered protected, but when you put them together, all of a sudden you have something. I'll just mention I was at a cybersecurity conference 2 weeks ago in Boston called Source Boston. If you ever have a chance to be in Boston and go, it's an amazing conference. Wendy Nather, I'm going to plug her a bit. She's an analyst with 451 Group, gave a talk on the chemistry of data. And she really addressed this emerging area of concern about how you take this piece of data, that piece of data, and a third, and you combine them together almost like chemicals, and you end up with something maybe you really couldn't have anticipated or expected that might create the type of vulnerability that would have never crossed your mind. Protected health information, or PHI, well, I'm sure everybody has heard of HIPAA and high tech, and they just in the last month or two they published the interim final rule, and this stuff just keeps becoming more and more burdensome. Those are the kinds of data, and now I want to talk briefly about costs, which is obviously something of huge importance to all of us. I'll bring you back to my initial experience of getting interested, not quite believing what the analysts would say. Very definitely there are costs involved with a data breach. Just exactly what they might be and how you understand them can be a little bit difficult. Your breach might not be the same as my breach, and so let's get into that. One of the things you don't often hear discussed, at least I don't, maybe you do, is when we talk about cost, whose costs exactly are we talking about? Well, typically we're talking about the breached entity or organization, but there are a lot of people who incur costs when data are breached. Here's a list of some of them. When you have a big credit card event with fraud, usually it's the issuing banks that pick up the tab. Most banks even waive, at least in the United States, most banks will waive the $50 deductible or whatever you would call that, and they eat the whole thing. But you stop to think about it. Customers could experience a loss, business partners, and certainly taxpayers. And there's a question I ask at every conference when I'm talking to people is, when the Secret Service or the FBI comes in and investigates a big data breach, do they actually send an invoice? So if my company is breached and the Secret Service runs up $500,000 in investigative costs, do they send me a bill? Well, so far I have yet to find anyone who thinks that they do or has experienced that they do. So essentially, all of us taxpayers are shouldering part of the burden for data breaches for both public and private entities. How do we measure costs? Well, I bet you almost every one of you out there has heard a number quoted of $190 to $220 per record as the cost of a data breach. Now, those numbers actually come from Ponemon Institute research. It's called the cost of a data breach. It's published for the United States and a bunch of other customers. I'm going to get specifically into the current report. And that's what you'd call a per record cost. And there are certain types of breaches and there are certain types of costs that are incurred during a breach that scale according to the number of records, but maybe not in the way people would necessarily think. And then sometimes the best way to talk about the cost of a breach is a fixed or overall amount. That would tend to be an estimate of the value of intellectual property or lost opportunity costs that an organization would experience as the result of a data breach. So keep in mind there are at least a couple of ways to measure costs, and there are some appropriate ways to apply that way of thinking and some inappropriate ways. Whenever I talk about this topic, I like to split costs into the things that we ought to be able to discover or estimate in our organization, and then, as you'll see when we come to another slide, things that are more difficult, if not impossible, to estimate. Another issue I'd like to bring up is that the costs of a data breach are usually not fully apparent for years, especially if it's one having to do with any large number of records or a publicly traded corporation. You folks may be aware that the SEC issued some updated guidance last year, I believe, that stressed that companies, publicly traded companies, had an obligation to both regulators and shareholders and potential shareholders to disclose material impacts from data breaches that had occurred and material impacts that might occur from deficiencies in their information security or threats that they thought they faced. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but just to give you an example, I've been following several breaches for years, TJX, Heartland, Sony, and Global Payments, and you really have to go to the SEC filings to understand what's happening. So TJX, I've been reading the annual and quarterly SEC filings since 2007. And even with the disclosure, it's still often difficult to figure out what's happening. Okay, so I'm at 20 minutes. I've got about another 15, right, Heather? Okay, I'll assume that that's right. As you look down this list that's been up on the screen for a while, these are things that in your organization you ought to be able to get an estimate for. Maybe not an exact estimate, maybe a range with the most likely estimate, which is actually something my company, Centric Security, specializes in, estimating these kind of categories and building probabilistic analyses around them. But somebody in your organization ought to have some invoices for incident response and forensics, for public relations, legal costs, for the cost of providing credit monitoring, and somebody should know what you paid if you got fined by a regulator. Okay, so here are some other things. One of the things people don't think about, and there have been a couple of breaches of information where this has come to play, typically HIPAA high-tech and FTC enforcements. CVS Caremark, for example, agreed to a settlement with the Federal Trade Commission over allegedly having disposed of some pharmacy records in a dumpster. There is some question whether they actually did, but I guess they thought it was easier just to agree. They agreed to upgrading certain aspects of the information security program. They agreed to doing a big risk assessment. And then they agreed to 20 years of every other year auditing of their information security program. So even though the fine they paid, which was like $2 million, $2.25 as I recollect, and maybe another $1 million on the information security risk assessment, it's this 20 years of $1.5 million every 2 years of audits is where the sting really comes in. And I think Walgreens got hit with something like that, and it's a fairly typical scenario when you have to settle with the FTC. I do want to talk a little bit about the kinds of costs that are difficult to estimate, things that I try to stay away from. And frankly, to express an opinion, I wish more speakers on this topic would just give it up. When you try to estimate a loss of competitive advantage, shareholder value, reputation, etc., this is very, very slippery business. For example, TJX, as best I and many other people can determine, suffered only a temporary blip in shareholder value, and within a year, their stores were doing more business than they had done in the previous year when you compare same store year over year. Reputation loss obviously annoys people. It's a hot button with senior executives, but when you really sit down to try to quantitatively measure what did it mean, most of the time what you come up with is it really didn't mean much. Now, that's not always true. Some people are punished severely for data breaches. One of the card processors back in 2005 or 6 actually went out of business. I think it was Diginotar, was a certificate issuer a year or so ago, had a big breach, was compromised. They ended up shutting down. So I think the point I want to make here is when you are trying to evaluate what any given data breach might cost your organization, please be very, very careful when you consider these elements, because it's much easier to be wrong than it is to be right. I'd like to briefly go through some of the resources that are out there for estimating and understanding costs of data breaches. I've already mentioned briefly Ponemon, and I won't be saying too much more about Verizon's DBIR because they really don't have a lot of information about cost. Their materials or their report is based upon forensic incidents and the analysis of forensic case reports, not just their own. But this year, I believe they had another 18 participating organizations, including the Secret Service, law enforcement in Europe, Australia, and also Carnegie Mellon University. It's a great report. I don't work for Verizon. I've been a critic of theirs in the past, but I do have a number of friends who work on that team, and I've been reading it for 5 or 6 years, and every year they get better. So this is the best one yet. I think you will be well rewarded for giving it a little time. You should be able to find it easily. So Ponemon Institute is one source of data. They publish a number of reports. I'm going to talk about 2 of them. The 2011 cost of data breach, which was actually published in March 2013. The new report is almost ready to go, but it's not published yet, so we're all going to have to wait to see how the numbers change, if at all. But here are a couple of things to remember when talking about Ponemon data, that they specifically limit themselves to breaches between 5 and 100,000 records. They only talk to companies who have experienced a breach in this range. They solicit minimum and maximum and midpoint estimates. And interestingly, the raw data are published in this last report, and I'm going to make a plug for Centric. We're actually responsible for that. Larry Ponemon is a friend of mine. I'm also a fellow at Ponemon Institute, and I managed to talk him into publishing sanitized data. So if you're interested in looking at the data yourself, which I did, you can draw some conclusions that the report didn't did not report. One of the other things I'd like to stress, Ponemon reports do tend to get some bad press in the InfoSec community, and I think in part it's because people really don't understand what goes into them. They don't just go ask one person at each of these 49 companies for an estimate and call it a day and go drink a Bud Light. In some of the companies, they conduct as many as 20 or 30 interviews with different people, and they combine all that together. So even though it's a survey methodology, and survey methodologies have known limitations, it's comprehensive and thorough. The other thing, and this is a huge mistake people make when citing these data, there is a specific disclaimer that the per record average should not be applied to large breaches. I forget which page it's on, but it couldn't be more plain. So it doesn't work to say, well, I might lose $1 million records at $200 a record. I mean, Larry Ponemon would be the first person to tell you you shouldn't do that. The dynamics of big breaches are very, very different. Here's some of the numbers from the last report. They did not publish a median or a minimum. Well, they published minimum and maximum. So the average, $194 a record, $5.5 million, down some from 2011. Of interest to me is that the median is about $1 million less than the average, which means that half of the breaches were less than $4.5 million, half were more. And if you take this even further and calculate a mode or most likely value, you will find that the typical breach was more in the range of $1.5 million to $1.7 million. So there are limitations to what you can understand when people only present averages, and I can clue you in to maybe expect some improvements in this regard in the report that's about to be published. They also publish a cost of cybercrime study, which doesn't particularly measure data breaches. It doesn't look at things that are errors or accidents. It really looks at response to crime, and it extrapolates weekly averages out to a year, which is problematic in my mind, and one of the reasons you get such a big range of $1.4 million to $46 million for a year. We are working on a talk having to do with something called the flaw of averages. There's a wonderful book, if you're interested, by a Stanford statistician, very readable. You don't have to know any math or statistics to understand it. The book is called The Flaw of Averages. It's by a man named Sam Savage. Great reading. Can really enlighten you about where averages can be helpful and where they're actually downright harmful and misleading. There's another great report out there people sometimes cite. It's a little different point of view. It's based on actual insurance claims payouts, published by Net Diligence, and the numbers on the face may be a little bit different than the Ponemon numbers, this 3.7 million average, and then they've got an average record cost of like $4, but when you really start tearing it apart and you start factoring out deductibles, which range from $50,000 to $1 million, and you factor out the fact that cyber insurance will not reimburse for lost customers, brand damage, etc., in my view, the numbers really aren't terribly different. I want to go briefly through a couple of examples here. I've only got a few more minutes. So basically, here are some examples of breaches that involve structured data. The TJX breach, according to the SEC filings, was something around perhaps 90 million credit card records. They have acknowledged in their SEC filings having spent somewhere between $170 and $190 million. And then the rumor on the street is they invested about $200 million in infrastructure improvements sooner than they had planned to, so they had lost opportunity cost as well. Interestingly, when you look at the per record number for this breach, it's about $2. So this is an example of what Ponemon Institute says. The dynamics on a big breach and the cost per record just don't work. The same is true for Heartland. I've looked at their SEC filings for years. As best I can determine, it's about $120 million or less that they spent. They did recover about $30 million from insurance, and then it also spurred them to accelerate development of their point-to-point encryption product, which, as I am told, has actually generated revenue and profits enough to take most of the sting, if not all of the sting, out of the breach. Sony had something like 100 million records exposed in multiple breaches. Right after it happened, within a couple months, they acknowledged having $171 million of costs, although they didn't exactly explain how they came up with that, because Sony is not based in the United States. They don't have the same reporting requirements as these other people do. Interestingly, Congress subpoenaed the chairman of Sony to come testify, and his response was he wrote them a letter and sent his lawyer. So I guess he didn't really care that much. Global payments is a really interesting one. This happened or was acknowledged a year or so ago. They just published some figures a week or two ago in their most current 10Q. That's the quarterly SEC filing, that they had revised their total cost of breach down. At one point, it was as high as $150 or $60 million, their estimate. But they've recovered some money, about $20 million through insurance, and the current figure stands just a little bit shy of $93 million. Now, what's interesting about that, it looks to have been about 1.5 million records, although some estimates are as high as 10 million. But either way, at 1.5 million records, it brings the per record cost in at something like $60 a record, which for a big breach is really higher than anything we've seen to date in the public record. And even if it's 10 million records, it's going to come in at about $9 a record, which is still 3 or 4 times higher than anything I've seen, at least, on a big breach. So there's something going on with the global payments breach that hasn't been disclosed yet to the public, and we'll just have to keep paying attention to understand what goes on there. The last one I want to talk about is this recent breach at the Department of Revenue of the state of South Carolina, in which the tax returns, including Social Security numbers, birth dates, and even bank accounts and routing numbers of 3.8 million taxpayers in South Carolina and 800,000 businesses were stolen by a hacker. Now, this one's been in the press a lot. The governor of South Carolina took a very proactive position, holding weekly news conferences, encouraging people to sign up for credit monitoring. And there are just a couple of things of note I want to mention about this. They estimate that it's going to cost about $20 million to take care of all the ramifications of this breach. At least that's what the legislature has set aside. About 12 or 13 million of that is to provide credit monitoring. And the most interesting thing is, last time I looked, over 22% of the affected people had signed up for credit monitoring, which may not strike you as a big deal, but typically what we've seen is that it's rare that more than 10% of people actually sign up, and more typically it's less than 5%. For example, the state of Texas Comptroller's Office had a breach similar in a way to this one in South Carolina, but only 3% of people actually signed up for credit monitoring. So these are examples of breaches of structured data. These all involved financial information, credit cards, that sort of thing that could quickly be monetized. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is unstructured data. There was a story, which should be things like intellectual property plans, secrets. These are the kind of things you really don't measure on a per record basis. So in the press a few years ago was a story, I have no way to verify it, but the Chinese, we like to pick on the Chinese, I think possibly for good reason, had stolen the plans for the new presidential helicopters. It was a $32 billion deal. I don't know if it caused anybody to change the plans, but it was certainly embarrassing. Coca-Cola has had its name in the press a couple times. Most recently, a competitor in China stole their merger and acquisition bid plans and underbid them for a large bottler in China. It was a $2.5 billion deal that Coke did not get as a result of cyber espionage. Closer to home, there's at least one story of employees, a couple of guys back in 2006, 2007, taking intellectual property and trying to give it to Pepsi-Cola, and the FBI got involved, and these guys were eventually arrested. I guess maybe they thought they were dealing with Pepsi officials, and it was an FBI informant, so they got caught. And then Ford Motor Company had a similar thing. It turns out he was a Chinese employee. I don't know what's up with the Chinese. Maybe they're just good at this. Was trying to hand over a bunch of plans and engineering designs to a Chinese car manufacturer. This happened both at GM and at Ford, different person. And the estimates, although not substantiated how they came up with the amount, were $40, $50 million lost to the company. So, you know, we have to be concerned not only about the structured data, which is maybe a little easier to think about, but also the unstructured data. I want to just talk briefly, and I think I'm almost out of time for my portion. One of the things we're working on at Centric, part of my personal research, professional research, is trying to see if we can build a model to more precisely or more reasonably estimate the correlation of cost and breach size. And the basic answer is not yet. Here are just a couple of graphs I built in Excel showing the relationship between the number of records and total costs, and it goes up. But if you're familiar with linear regression and you know what this R-squared value means, even though the line looks very straight and it rises, you always get a straight line with this kind of analysis, and the 0.41 number suggests this correlation is really not very strong. So yeah, the more records, the more it's going to cost, but just more precisely than that, we can't say much. And then when you look on a per record basis, well, you'd expect the cost per record to go down as you have more records, and it certainly does, but again, it's a very weak correlation. So we're still working on it. Centric and I are actually co-authors on a paper that will be presented at George Mason University in June at the workshop on economics of information security, or the WISE seminar. And I and some other folks are working on a model to refine this. So I've been going pretty fast. I hope I've said something of interest to you. Basically, this is kind of the wrap-up, that there are many, many kinds of threats and many different kinds of breaches, and as I said earlier, my breach and your breach may not be the same, i.e. one size does not fit all. Breaches are caused by all sorts of things besides maliciousness. They involve many types of data, many types of costs, and there are useful preventive, detective, and mitigating technologies, which unfortunately time does not permit me to get into that too much, but I am at this point going to introduce my friend and colleague, the chairman and CEO of Watchful Software, Chuck Foley, who is one of the sponsors of this webinar. And Chuck, I want to thank you at this point, and also Heather, I want to thank you and Triumphant. At this point, Chuck is going to do a presentation, and in order to make that happen, I need to hand off the presentation baton to Watchful Software. So Thomas McClinton, who is one of the U.S. sales reps, is actually going to start driving now. Are you good, Thomas?
All right, can you guys hear me?
There you go. I thought the webinar
There
had
we go.
thrown me out because I was finished.
No. We had a little muting problem. So thank you. I appreciate you guys spending some time today. Patrick went over a lot of detail and a lot of data. We're going to kind of roll up our sleeves, get a little more real world, and see how some of this applies from a "oops, I made a mistake" kind of perspective, which is what happens every day. So Thomas, if you head to the next slide, please. It seems like controlling access to our information has gotten to be a really, really difficult problem. As Patrick went over, there is chapter and verse on data breaches that are caused either by people coming in from the outside or, as in the case of Coca-Cola, Ford, GM, major medical manufacturers, etc., WikiLeaks, people are actually on the inside. So Thomas, if you hit the space bar, for the last 10, 20 years, we have spent massive amounts of money. Customers have spent billions of dollars trying to secure the perimeter, build a stronger network perimeter to protect those users and that information. It's anti-spam, antivirus, intrusion prevention, intrusion detection, next-gen firewalls, you name it. Hit the key, please. The problem is, if you're an enterprise with a lot of users, one more time, please, those users are causing the majority of the breaches where information is actually getting out. According to most of the studies you'll see, negligent insiders, as an example, listed by Global Knowledge as one of the top 10 cybersecurity threats of 2013, it's those insiders that are causing the loss and leak of information. They send things to Gmail accounts, they send things to people on the outside, they put them in Dropbox accounts, they put them on USB keys, carry them around their iPhones, or send secure information via email to places where it's read on BlackBerry or iPhone or Android devices that can get lost, stolen, hacked, and cracked. Hit the key, please, Thomas. So what the industry is now starting to concentrate on is not so much perimeter security, which is good and valid and good hygiene, but complementing that with data-centric security. Because if you're going to have those cracks in your perimeter, if those users are going to come and go, if they're going to take things with them, instead of trying to secure the perimeter, how about if you secure the information itself? That way, if the information does find its way outside of the perimeter, it gets put in Dropbox, it gets sent to the wrong person. Consider the scenario of a CEO that types a very confidential memo about pending headcount reductions, sends it to the 10 or 15 people on his board and management team, and realizes 1 second after he hit the enter key that, oops, that last email address was the wrong person. That happens every day. Or a vice president of sales that's considering leaving a company. We all know what they do for the week or the month before they leave. They fill up every USB key they can get their hands on with customer list, pricing information, costing information, HR information, and it escapes the control of the network perimeter. But what if that information was locked? What if you could keep those kind of data breaches from happening? Hit the key, please, Thomas. That's really what data-centric security is meant to address. With a data-centric security solution, organizations can define their own security model. And it's probably going to be a multi-level security model. They're going to have levels of information that are public. It is emails back and forth about, let's go to lunch next week, or can we set up a meeting for Friday at 3 o'clock, or it's data sheets, brochures, general information that doesn't need to have exceptional methods taken to take care of it. But then there are some higher levels of information with greater sensitivity. There are things like corporate policies and procedures and the way that a company works. That might be internal use only. You have to be an employee at that company to have access to that information. Or it's email traffic about strategies and plans and pending customers that you don't want disclosed outside of the company. Maybe you've got a higher level, which is confidential, where you must be in management at the company, and that might include HR information, payroll information, customer information, and maybe you got a level that is secret. You need to be in top management to access this. Pending mergers, acquisitions, financial results, long-term strategic plans, etc. A company that has data-centric security can define an information security model where things are classified into these levels, for this example, public, internal use, confidential, and secret. And then users throughout the company 5, 10, 20, 50,000, it doesn't matter, are assigned credentials that are appropriate to their level. All employees get internal use. Maybe you have to be management to have confidential level of access, and maybe you need to be senior management to have top secret level of access. So now that you've defined your information security policy, now you have a way to classify information of all types, be they documents, spreadsheets, presentations, emails, whatever. Then, and users are assigned to their levels, then you can secure the information. So if you have something that is internal or confidential and secret, it can be encrypted. It can be protected so that the only people that can open it and read it and use it are people with the right credentials. And you can control what actions they can take. Not only can they read it, but can they print it, can they forward it, can they copy it, etc. Thomas, hit the spacebar key. In real world, this is what it looks like. Let's say that we've got an executive vice president that creates a very secret document about the next 2 years' financials and marketing strategies for the company. The kind of things that were literally stolen by a GM employee and offered to China. Well, if that happens, if that information is classified properly, hit the spacebar, Thomas, and it is sent to a number of people, maybe it got sent to somebody outside the company who only has public access. It's a vendor, it's a partner, it might even be a competitor. Well, that was a mistake. And the good news is they can't see it, they can't access it, they can't read it. All they get is a notification that you've received an encrypted email that you don't have access to. Other people were supposed to get that communique. The vice president, who has access to secret level of information, he's helping develop those plans, and he can read it, he can print it, but he can't forward it or send it anywhere. And then, of course, the CEO, who has top secret clearance, he can read it, edit, print it, save it, etc. So through this process of data-centric security, when information is created, it can be classified and protected. And then no matter where it goes, if it gets out through malicious intent or if it's an error, it's okay, because only people with express credentials can access it and use it. Hit the key, please, Thomas. Now, done right, this will be totally seamless to the users. Everyone's familiar with creating emails, to, from, subject, etc. With a well-designed data-centric information security solution, you would have an environment where in the user workflow, he or she can choose, is it internal or confidential or top secret? Or the company might have rules. If you'll notice in this example, there is an alert that says an automatic classification rule was applied as a part of a policy because that contains text which says 2013 business plan. 2013 business plan is something that in our company we consider secret. So without the user doing anything, the information was automatically classified. That's the way a good security engine should work. Hit the spacebar, Thomas. In addition, not only is it seamless to the user and dynamically classifies, hit the spacebar again please, but it gives the user some awareness. Most consultants will tell you one of the most difficult things in implementing an information security strategy is getting your user buy-in and keeping it in front of the user. So as you notice, this email was automatically classified. The user didn't do anything, but it got a red border around it when he classified it. The user is now a part of this process. Hit the spacebar, Thomas. And if the user decides that he wants to change that, if he wants to downgrade it from secret to confidential, now the user is brought further into the process. The border changes from a red border of top secret to a yellow border of confidential, but the user has to agree. He has to click that, yes, I want to change the classification to this, which is a deviance from the corporate policy, and this is logged and audited and can be reported on a daily basis. Hit the key, please. Through this process, hit the spacebar one more time, Thomas. Through this process, you can make sure that all of your information, and not just emails, but it's documents and spreadsheets, are classified. You can make sure that the users can't hit the save key until they select the classification. Hit the spacebar again, and then once they do, and they create some information and they save it, it can be dynamically fingerprinted. All documents of a certain classification can get a dynamic fingerprint, a watermark, which protects the company from legal exposure. And it gets a digital fingerprint that creates metadata so that this information can be tracked and followed. Know who sent this to who else, where it was printed, when it was saved and edited, etc. Spacebar, please. Done right, it can apply to all types of information, be it web-based email, spreadsheets, business plans, videos, images, etc. That is one approach to address the problems that Patrick was talking about. We know that there's been huge emphasis on data protection, data loss, data leakage, because the exposure continues to grow. It used to be that 1 in 10 companies would have a data breach, then it was 1 in 4. In the latest Ponemon study from December 2012, 90% of CIOs and CSOs surveyed said they had a breach of confidential or sensitive information. It's becoming a fact of life. And what we've determined is we realize that just securing the perimeter is not going to do the job to protect that information. We need to actually secure the information itself, when and where it's created, so only the right people have access to it. Spacebar, please. That's data-centric security protection. And unfortunately, in today's world, we don't have 10 or 20,000 well-mannered users sitting at their workstations all day. They're on the move. They've got iPads, iPhones, Androids, Windows Mobile, Blackberries, you name it. And you can't stop their ability to work in the name of security. So you've got to make sure that whatever strategies you take to protect your information, that it extends out to the new elastic perimeter of the enterprise. Those smartphones, BYOD devices that are proliferating everywhere, not just for emails, but people use them as USB keys. They take presentations on them. They take financials and statistics on them. They access web servers to download information of all types. So you've got to make sure that whatever you choose, that this information can be protected not only in your secure network perimeter, but even when they're outside roaming around internationally. Next slide, please. That is the approach that we're taking to data-centric information protection to help address the issues and mitigate the costs that Patrick had gone over. If you'd like any further information on it, we'd be more than happy to spend time with you. Please just let us know after this webinar. Heather, back to you.
Okay, actually, I'm going to grab the presentation back from Thomas. And maybe.
So, yeah, while you're doing that, I want to be sensitive to allow enough time for questions. So thank you, Chuck, and of course, Patrick. And I just went ahead and typed in the chat box what I would have said about triumphant, so you guys can read through that. And then I want to make sure that we can open it up in the last 5 minutes for questions. So I think at this time, Patrick, you'll unmute everyone.
Yes, I do. And before we go there, I just, this is a little blurb about Heather Goodnight and Triumphant. And I'm trying to figure out how to unmute everybody. How do you do that? Maybe like that.
Muted.
It would appear that some of you have maybe muted yourselves. I'm not sure. If you have a question and you're muted, would you please raise your hand? Because there are 2 of you that I cannot unmute. So while we're waiting on questions, we've got up contact information for the various participants today. Whoops, sorry.
Charles or Thomas, did you hear the question? There's going to be a little background noise. Those, please go back to raising your hand. Okay. So, Charles, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. So can you see the question?
I cannot see the questions. If you read them to me.
Okay. Yes. So for new data, the solution is clear, but what about old data? How is it possible to apply watchful software?
So for old data, I can tell you how we do it. There may be other ways, but in Watchful we've created a set of tools that our partners, such as Triumphant, use that can go across existing file shares or servers to be able to scan existing unstructured data, things like emails and documents and presentations, etc., to see if they contain either context or content, such as the owner or certain content. Let's say that you have flagged for your company that anything that says financial results is confidential, or anything that says company confidential, as so many companies have a template they use for that. So you can scan existing data to find out if it matches those criteria, and if it does, then the classification will be applied and the encryption will be applied, and anybody with those rights will be automatically able to use it.
Okay, he said. I think kind of
Okay, I am not able to unmute. Forgive me if I get your name backwards. Ayapa Reddy. I click on mute and nothing happens. So she must have herself muted or himself muted.
Yeah. So we have another question. I think this is maybe probably a good one for the group at large. He says, do you believe the insurance companies that hide secrecy and often their software reputation?
That would seem to be maybe a question for me, Heather. I'm not exactly sure I understand it. If the question is, do I believe that having a cybersecurity policy, insurance policy, encourages companies not to disclose? Is that what you mean? If it is, I would tend to agree with that. One of the trends we're starting to see in breach disclosure is that by bringing in a law firm right at the beginning, breached organizations are starting to claim client attorney privilege as the reason for not saying anything about their breaches. So I don't know if that addresses the question or not. I haven't actually read a cybersecurity insurance policy. It would be interesting to know if there are maybe some stipulations that require non-disclosure. I've got a colleague. I'm going to find out about that. That's a good question, though, if I understand it correctly. I'm sure it's a good question, even if I don't understand it correctly, too.
I do believe, though, that if there is a data breach and it's one that can put the company at risk financially, that if the company can show that they have implemented a policy and taken steps that are commercially reasonable and viable, that will significantly mitigate their potential financial exposure in the case of a breach. It's been shown time and again that companies that take steps like watermarking confidential documents to remind employees, and it's one of the reasons that you see the disclaimers on the emails these days.
Yeah.
I think it's really clear, and there's a good precedent for that.
I agree with you completely, Chuck.